Ever thought maybe you won't submit that tax return? Well, in this video, I'll tell you what happens if you don't. As a business accountant, my team and I spend all day long helping business owners on their journey. And one of the things I think most owners, including myself when I was originally self-employed, have thought about is, what happens if I just don't submit this tax return? You know, it's a lot of hassle, it's a lot of worry. Quite often people are thinking about doing it around Christmas. I mean, the tax return has to be in on the 31st of January every year. And we always say to people every year, make sure you do it early. You know, you've got anywhere from about mid-April to the 31st of January to do it. You want to do it early so you know where you are, what your tax is due and all these kind of things. But people do tend to leave it when they do it themselves to the last minute. And as a result, I think a lot of people think, do you know what? They just put it off, and sometimes they don't submit it. But I know for a lot of people, they're so worried about not submitting it that they do go and get it in at the last minute just to make sure. I mean, actually, there was about 2,700 people on Christmas Day this year in 2020, the last Christmas just gone, that actually did it on Christmas Day itself. And there was about 18,000 that did it on the 1st of January. So as you can see, a lot of people do take that festive time to look after their tax return. Personally, I didn't do any tax returns over the Christmas week, and I do it for a living. So, but whatever floats your boat. So let's get into it. But before we do, make sure to click the subscribe button below if you enjoy these type of videos to be notified whenever we release more just like it. So what happens if you don't submit your tax return? Now, the key thing, of course, is they give you a fine. Everything with HM Revenue and Customs, or HMRC as we call them, and most people generally refer to them, there's a fine associated with it. You know, if you don't submit it, you get an instant fine. That fine is £100. So the minute you don't get it in on that day, it could be the 1st of February, doesn't matter, that's the fine. Now, in years gone by, in order to get out of that fine, you pretty much had to die, or you had something really, really drastic. I could probably count on a very small tally of the amount of people that have actually got away with that penalty. You had to have some serious issues to be able to do that, because obviously they give you such a fairly generous timescale to do that tax return, nearly 9 months. So you should, in theory, be able to do that. Now, however, with COVID being around, what they have said is that they're going to be more lenient towards a COVID-style excuse. Now, at the moment, we haven't seen that, but I've seen it certainly with Companies House that they've been far more lenient than they would be. So there is that option, but I wouldn't bank on it. Now, what happens? You get the £100. You think, well, I can suck up £100 like it's not going to be a problem. But if you don't do it and it gets up to about 12 months, your penalties can go up to £1,600. And then there's also interest and penalties for not paying your tax. Now, so those things can get very, very quickly up. I mean, we see every year, we see owners come to us and say, oh, look, do you know what? I've buried my head in my sand. And now they come up and they pull their little bit of paper up and it's like a £1,600 penalty. And they're like, but you can get rid of these, yeah? And most of the time the answer is no, unfortunately we can't. Sometimes you'll get rid of some of them because it can be based on other things. But generally, those basic non-submission penalties are very, very difficult to get rid of. In years gone past, it used to be linked to how much tax you owed. So if you owed a lot of tax, then you paid a lot of penalties if you didn't submit your tax return. If you owed no tax, those penalties would disappear. But unfortunately, that system went by the wayside, and I think it's probably because a lot of people knew they just didn't need to file it, especially if you had smaller incomes, because there was no incentive to, really. So the system we're at now is instant fine. So do it. If you've had a letter and you think, oh, I don't need to do that, my circumstances have changed, you still need to call them and tell them. And in actual fact, if you do get a tax return letter and you think there's no reason why I should have this, I've finished being self-employed and that was the reason I had it, or something like that, then you can actually phone them, and most of the time they will actually remove the need for that tax return. So that's the first one, is you're going to have penalties. Now, there's a couple of other things I think are worth talking about aside from the penalties. One is if you're going for a mortgage and you've been self-employed, you're going to need what they call SA 302s. Now, that's the front page of your tax return, sort of like it's not really your front page, but for a lot of people with the way it's presented, it feels like your front page. It's the calculation that goes on the front that shows what your actual taxable income declared to the tax people was. And that's what the mortgage lenders use in about 99% of the cases to do. Now, if you've not got your tax return submitted, you won't have that document, or you might have the document in draft, but what mortgage lenders generally want is they then want a print from your Revenue and Customs site that shows that you have actually sent that tax return in. It's called a tax year overview, and it shows they can marry the two up and see, okay, yep, I can see that's the level of income and the tax that was due, and you can see that from the revenue site that they know about it because they've got the same tax bill as this print. So that would be one of the issues, is you might not have your information you need for future lending, mortgages and the like, so definitely get that in for that reason. The other thing it can do is it can cause you weird problems with benefits as well, because the system, especially universal credit, you declare things as you go and they pay you money. Obviously, if you then submit a tax return later, there might be some data on there that they didn't know about. I know in the old working tax credits system, I'm not sure if that's still available in places in the UK, but because it's been slowly phased out, but in that system, doing a tax return late would prompt quite often a problem with that kind of benefit, because they'd suddenly have more data and income that they didn't realise you had. So that should be at the front of your mind as well. If you have got some sort of benefits, make sure that tax return is always up to date. And I think if you're very lucky, you could be in a position where most years you get repayments. So if you're like a construction worker who gets what they call CIS deductions, you get tax taken off you at source, generally up to a certain point, and there's other videos on the channel on this, you'll find that you can get a repayment each year. And a lot of subcontractors come to rely on that for their holiday or paying off Christmas or whatever they want to do. Now, one of the things that with tax returns, of course, if you don't submit it, you're not going to get your repayment. But what people don't realise is there's a time limit to these things. After a few years, you'll find actually you won't be able to claim those repayment anymore. And it depends on the type of thing you're trying to claim and the type of thing you're trying to do with your tax return. But if you think 2, 3, 4 years, if you're going into like a 4 or 5 year mark for a lot of things, you just won't be able to claim those things back. It doesn't apply. Sometimes there's different limits depending on what you're talking about. But if you just think you don't really want to leave these tax returns being overdue for more than a couple of years for most things to just be completely sure. Now, and that is an issue. So you find it sometimes with people, they'll submit it expecting this repayment, and then they'll get a letter back saying, yeah, thanks for your tax return, but you're outside the timescale. So there are these timescale issues, and obviously you want to be able to make sure you get your repayment. So that all being said, you've then, let's say you haven't submitted your return, you just think, do you know what, I'm just going to leave it. I'm cool. Come at me, bro. Here's my £1,600 penalties. I'm just going to leave it and see what happens. Well, obviously, you're going to get debt collectors turning up for those penalties. So in normal times, I think in COVID, everything seems slightly more lax, but generally, you would end up with collection letters and more sternly worded letters, and then they would eventually give it to a collections agent like they would with any other debt, and you'll have people knocking on your door trying to collect that money. So that can be a stress in itself. But worse than that, what they can do, and we've seen this plenty of times over the year, is they can raise an assessment on you. They can say, do you know what? Our industry data says you, as a tradesman, just picking that out of thin air because I've seen it a few times, you owe us, we think you earn 30 grand plus a year, so here's your tax bill, your NI bill, all the penalties and interest for all the overdue tax, and then you have to go and fight them to change that. And that's probably worst case scenario, is then you've got this massive tax bill that you might not even owe, because quite often, sometimes, not always, but sometimes you might have been in a really bad earnings place, couldn't afford your accountant who normally does it, or you don't have the ability to do it yourself, can't afford it, and actually you've not got the money to pay for it. So there can be all these extra worries on top of it. I mean, there are some tax charities that you can go out and reach out to as well, which are really good. I'm sure if you Google them, you'll find a few of them. But there are those options. But in the majority of cases we see, actually, it isn't that. It's just people have just buried their head in the sands and don't want to do it, or they've got a particular aversion to something HMRC have done in recent years against them, and then they think, well, I'm not going to pay my tax. But look, ultimately, they will raise these assessments and they will harass you. So that's kind of the worst case scenario. And of course, then it spirals, because then you might get around, before you know it, you've hit the next year, you've got another penalty, and you can get this massive tax debt that can end up putting you into something like an IVA or ultimately bankruptcy to get out of. So because especially if the time limits are gone and you've not appealed their assessment, because they've got time limits on them as well. So just bear those in mind and ultimately submit your tax return online. One of the things you can do, if you don't have the figures and you just think, you know what, I just want to get it done, I don't want a penalty, you can actually submit it with what they call a provisional tick in it. There's a box that says there are provisional figures and estimates in this return, and you can even, there's any other sort of information, we call it white spacing, but there's a box there that you can put some information in, and tell your story in there, because then at least you've got it in, the computer will register you of having sent the return, and at least you've got it in there, and you can actually amend your return up to a year from the deadline. So quite often that is a way of doing it. If you haven't quite got all the information, but you've got a lot of it, or a good estimation of it, put it in with those ticks, and then redo it a year, up to a year later. So that's it. That's what happens if you don't submit a tax return. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to share it with people who you know would appreciate it, and I'll see you on the next one.